Welcome back to this class. In our previous video we did our project number 3. So in this video I thought it is a good idea we first look at CSS Grid before we do our next project. So this is going to be a short video, so it won't take much time. But I need us to first look at CSS Grid, and then we use it to do our next projects and even in the coming projects. Okay, so if you are new here, please subscribe, and to those ones who have subscribed, thank you so much. So let's go into it. So CSS Grid is a two-dimensional layout that we can use for creating responsive items on the web. Grid items are arranged in columns, and you can easily position rows without having to mess around with the HTML code. So that one brings us to say, what is the two-dimension layout? So a two-dimension layout, as you can see, a two-dimension layout is, let's first look at a one-dimension layout. So this is a one-dimension layout, has only rows. So when you find you are arraying items in a row, only a row, that is a one-dimension layout. And then a two-dimension layout is a layout that contains both rows and columns. So when you look at something like this is a two-dimension layout, and when you look at something like this is a one-dimension layout. So one-dimension layout only contains rows, and then a two-dimension layout contains rows and columns. So when you have something like a header, you're aligning something like in a header or something that it doesn't involve very many rows and columns, you can actually, that is a one-dimension layout. So the best practices while handling one-dimension and two-dimension layouts is that if you encounter one-dimension layout, it is the best approach is to use a flexbox, and then if you are using two-dimension layouts, then the best approach is to use CSS Grid. So we are going to be seeing these use cases over and over, and the combination of CSS Grid and flexbox makes it so wonderful. When you are using CSS, you can actually design a very complicated web layouts using these two frameworks. So some of the features of CSS Grid. So a grid layout model works with all latest browsers, and that is really so wonderful. Those days when it had come, the support was somehow limited, but right now most of the CSS Grid features, they are all supported in modern browsers. It consists of two components, which are a grid container and then the grid items. So if you remember Flex, even Flex had a Flex container and then Flex items, then even the same approach, they use it in a grid. So CSS Grid has two major components, and this is very important. Take note, we have two components in a grid. So the first one is the grid container. A grid container is the parent element that holds grid items placed within rows and columns. So for the purpose of making an element adopt the behavior of a grid container, set its display property to either grid or inline grid. So we are going to look at examples of grid. So grid items, a grid item is a child element that is present inside a grid container. So inside a container, by default, there is one item present for each column in each row. However, you can span the grid items across numerous rows and columns. So we're going to look at what does that one mean. So this is a graphical interface representing like a grid container and then the grid items. So if you can look at this container, the one which is orange is a grid container, and then this is light orange is their grid items. So you have a big container, then inside you have the items, and that's the same concept with flex. Or this is a grid container, then is a flex container, and then this is a grid items, then that is a flex items, but the same concept really. So some of the terms you will come across. The first one is that in a grid, as we have said, we have columns. So the vertical lines in a grid within which items are placed are regarded as columns in a grid. So you see these ones are columns. Actually, normally take grid. A good example is if you understand like Excel tables. If you look at Excel or if you look at tables, the tables in Word or Excel, I always take them exactly the way grid is. So you're going to look, they have a lot of similarities. We deal with columns and rows, and that is something that is we're going to use to make it more understandable. So you look here, we have like 3 columns. We have here column 1, column 2, and column 3. So these ones are the columns, and then we have also rows. You can look at these rows 1, 2, and row 3. So the grid is always consisting of rows and columns, and this is very important to note, because when we start dealing with grid, it is very important to understand how many columns do I need or how many rows do I need in this grid. Then another important terminology is column gap. So the column gap, we are going to see it is also it is very important. So the gap between 2 rows, 2 columns is column gap, and then the gap between 2 rows is row gap. So when you combine a column gap with a row gap, this whole gap is called grid gap. So you can just write a short form. Instead of saying column gap 10 pixels or 20 pixels and row gap 20 pixels, you can simply say grid gap is 20 pixels, unless you want them to be different sizes. So another thing is lines. So these lines are going to be so much important when it comes also to grid. We want to know where does this grid item, where does it start. So we have like 1, 2, 3, 4. So you can see that here we have 4. With 3 grid items, we have 4 lines. This is very important to note. So you see we have 4 lines with 3 grid items. So it is going to help us when we start spanning some of these things. So we are going to jump in actually, because theory is always somehow more complicated, but when we start doing these things in code, it will start getting actually easier. So in this example, we are going to see a simple grid layout. How do we create something like this? So the most important thing is, if you look at this example, I have how many items? I have A, B, C, D. So logically, those are 4 items. So this is a very simple trick. If you have 5 items, so even in HTML, this is the representation of the HTML code. We have our container, and then the container we have simply 4 items, A, B, C, D, and the code looks like this. So the CSS code is going to be targeting some of these things. It's going to be targeting the container, and then targeting the item, and then targeting these individual items 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I think it's a good idea. Let's get into the code and see how this goes. Okay, so I'm just going to go to I'm just going to go to my desktop, and I'm just going to find my folder of HTML fundamentals, and I've created a folder called CSS Grid. So I'm just going to right click this and open with code. So this is going to open the project with VS Code. Okay, so far now I have this is the slide I was presenting. So you'll find, by the way, these starter files, you'll find them in the repo. They'll be there in the description, in the video description. You check and find that starter files. So I'm just going to create index.html. So I just create index.html. Okay, so it is creating our file. Okay, so from there, I don't know if this is big enough. Let me try to make it much more bigger. Okay, that looks great. So you know this technique, how it goes. Okay, so I have my index.html. I'm just going to create also another file, which is style.css for our styles. Okay. Okay, so here I'm just going to put CSS Grid. Okay, so here is where we're going. Let's first link our CSS. So let's go to link CSS like that. Let me make it big enough. Okay, so this is here on this line we have linked to our style.css. So in this case they're in the same folder. If you look at it, that's why it is not it is not in different folder, but since it is in the same folder, we simply put style.css. So let's start. So first of all, we have a container with 5 items. So we simply say container, and in the container we put 5 items. So I could say item and then .1. So this one creates a div with class item and 1. You see that these are 2 classes, and we're going to see how they are going to be helpful in helping us to design our grid item. So this one is A. So I'm just going to simply duplicate this 4 times. So Ctrl C on the new line, Ctrl V, Ctrl V, Ctrl V 4 times, like that. So this is B, C, and D. Okay, so even here I'm just going to change 2, 2, and then 3, and then 4. Okay, so let me explain once again where we are getting these classes. So if I go back to the PowerPoint, so if you look, the 4 items, we got them from our design. So we want at the end of the day our design to look like this. So irrespective of how the design want to end up with, the first thing is to first identify how many items am I dealing with. These ones could be images, they could be anything. So how many items am I dealing with? So if you are dealing with items, if you are dealing with, for instance, if these ones were there are 4 items, so if in the HTML, make sure you have also 4 items. Then another thing now, the item class is going to help us to give styles that are similar in all items. For instance, the color the color and this border radius and even padding, those things they have in common. But then 1, 2, 3, 4 are going to hold individual styles for each item. So for instance, you see A is having there is a way how it is arranged, then there's B how it is arranged. So these ones are going to contain individual styles. Okay, so let's continue with our project. So for now, if I try to open this, if I try to go live, there is nothing much going on. We have A, B, C, D, like so. Okay, so let's do some styles. So the first thing, I'm just going to work on item. So copy, Ctrl C, item. We can just quickly do a browser reset. Is that the word browser? Okay, so I can simply do a browser reset, star, padding 0, margin 0, I think that's it, and box sizing border box, as simple as that. So that one's going to handle our box sizing. So let me just target dot item. So what do we want on our item? So when you look at this, when you look at our item, the first thing is it has some certain color, and then it has some border radius, and then it has some padding. Okay, so let's first work on that. So the first thing, I'm just going to say, let's do padding, maybe 2 rem. Let me first try 2 rem, which I'll increase if it is needed. And then border radius, let's try like 10 pixels. And then we have background color. This looks like Sunday brown. Okay, then what else? Okay, so what do we have right now? Okay, so that is what so far what we have. Okay, this is looking cool already. Not so really. So that is, we can first leave the item on that level. Okay, so let's now concentrate on getting the container. Let's look at the container styles. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to my PowerPoint to look at this, how it is arranged. So now the first thing when we are doing this, the first thing we do is we want to get the container and we give it display grid. Okay, so the first thing we do is we go to the container. So I'm just going to get the container containing all these item container, and then the first thing I give display grid. So if I say display grid, I don't know if anything happens. Nothing much has happened. Okay, so we start identifying some things. We have said that a grid, it contains rows and columns. So the first thing is to ask ourselves, how many columns do we need? So how do we determine the columns? I come back to the layout I want to produce. If you look at this, if this is even in Microsoft Word table, you would identify that these ones are 3 columns. So I have the first column here, I have the second column for this D, and then I have this C also. So I come up to say I have 3 columns. So I would say, okay, so if there are 3 columns, I go to the container and I define the number of columns I want in the grid, and it is defined by the int called grid template columns. So I say grid template columns I need is, so instead of saying 3, what you do is you define them. You define how big those ones, how big you want those columns to be. Now there are different ways how we can define them. I can simply say let them to be 200. So the first column, let it to be 200 pixels, another one let it to be 200 pixels, and then another one to be 200 pixels. As simple as that. So this line means that when you say grid template columns, you are trying to define the columns in the grid, and you define them by giving them the size they should occupy. I can say if I want them to be equal, I say the first column should be 200 pixels, the second column should be 200 pixels, the third column should be 200 pixels. And this produces something like this at this point. It makes sure all the columns are occupied in 3 columns, as you can see here right now. So if you see here what we are having a challenge that all our items are touching each other, so we can define the gap. So I can go ahead and I say grid gap. I can define a grid gap, and I say SA 100. Okay, and you can see we have the gap already. So this is just actually as easy, more easy than even I saw. So you just only define the columns, and then you define the gap if you want. And if you wanted rows, by the way, you could even go ahead and define the rows if you wanted to. But for sure right now, the only thing I want is I just want them to only define the columns, because the rows for now they'll be auto generated like so. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is from there, what you're going to do is now start looking at each individual item. So now we look at item 1. So let me just take it 1. So for item 1, what do we want from item 1? So we go back to our PowerPoint. At this point, we go back to our PowerPoint. So if you look at item 1, which is A, it is spanning. If this is in Microsoft Word tables, what would this mean? Would be like merging. How many columns, or how many columns is it merging, or how many rows it's occupying? So if you look at this, columns, the number of columns it is occupying 1 and 2. So in terms of lines, as we said, if you go back to look at the lines, I think it was the last thing we saw. So if these were lines and there are 3 columns, so this is 1, 2, 3. So you see that actually it is spanning from 1 to 3. So here we come and we ask ourselves, how many columns is it occupying? If this, I put this nearby this one, you will see that it is occupying from here up to here. So how many column lines do we have? If I to make this one more bigger for you guys, so it's occupying from, like, this is 1, this is 2, this is 3. So the A item is occupying from 1 to 3. It's occupying from column 1 to column 3. So what I do is I come here and I say this is occupying grid column. That is here where we say grid column, and then you say 1, it is occupying from 1 to 3, and this is how you write 1 to 3, right? So if you write that, you look at that, it occupies from 1 to 3. this is coming out good, guys. This is really nice. So as simple as that. By the way, you just specify for how many columns do I need this to span. So how about rows? We want to occupy how many rows, and we want only one. So we simply say for grid row, I want only one row, and I simply write 1, and it remains the way it is. So we want it to occupy 3 columns and 1 row. So we do this to all items. So I go to the item 2. So you see, it occupies from the number of rows it occupies is 1. The number of columns it occupies 2 columns. 3 from column line 1 to column line 3. Okay. We go to B. So what about B? B is occupying 1 column, but is occupying how many rows? Is occupying 2 rows, and that is from, if in terms of lines, by the way, if there are 2 rows, that means you are having 3 lines, as you could see from here. This is 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So when you have 3 columns, 1, 2, 3 columns, but the lines, you have 4 lines. Okay, this is how we calculate the lines. So it is for B, which is item 2. So let me go back to the code. So for 2, how many, we ask ourselves how many rows or how many columns do we need. So for grid column, is 1. It occupies 1 column. But for grid rows, it's occupying from 1 to 3. And look at that. Okay. I think on the container, let's also define that we have to, do we have to define the grid template rows that we need to. Okay, let's try to define grid template rows, and we can define them. For now, let's first leave them. Let's first continue. We give all the items their spaces. Okay, so the item B is occupying grid column 1, and then this is 1 to 3. Okay, and this is how it becomes. Okay, our grid gap has disappeared, and for some reason, okay, let's first see. Grid rows, we have 1 to 3. I just say 2 to 3, and we see what happens. No, that is 1 to 3. Okay, let's first continue. Don't mind, it has taken our A. Okay, so let's see 3. So for 3, if we look at 3 in terms of rows and columns, that is C. So C and D, and by the way, okay. So if you look at where this B is located before we go to C, if you look at where it is located in terms of column, it is occupying line 3 to 4. Let's try that. So here on B, column is not 1, is occupying 3, 4. So let's first try that and we see. Yeah, for sure. So you specify this grid column is actually not the column where it is located, but is the position or the number in terms of lines, where is it occupying. So you say it is located from which line. So it is located from this line to this other line. And for sure, you see automatically, even if you don't work on C and D, they are already in position the way they should be. But we could go ahead and we position them, and you look at where do I want it to go. Okay, so if I want it to for C, it is occupying from grid 2. It is in column 2, and so we could say where is it located. So we simply give like coordinates of where these items is located. So if I look at it, is located first of all on grid row 2. So I would say grid row 2. Let's first see if we can give so if I say grid row, for grid row is occupying 2. Grid row is 2, but the grid column is occupying from spanning from 1 to 2, and this is the same thing to 4. They are having the same scenario. Okay, so okay, so C has disappeared. This is occupying from 2, is occupying 2 to 3, I guess. Yeah, so you can see, you simply define. So if I go back to 2, is you ask yourself where is it located, is in row 2, and then it starts from, this is line 1, this is line 2, this is line 3, this is line 4. So this is how you define them. So it is from line 1 to line 2, then it is from, this one is from 2 to 3. Okay, as simple as that. And then you have your code looking like that. So this was easy. So let's try out some other example. Let's try out some other example. So I think in the code, I'm just going to try out one more example, and then you will do another one as an exercise. So I have this one, and then I have this one. So I think I should leave this one as the exercise, so that you try out this example 2, and then this one I'm just going to try out this content 1, this example 3. I wanted you to try this. Anyways, for the purposes of time, let me try out this one, this example 3, and for you guys, you are going to try out example 2. That one would be great for you to try. Please, when we are doing these exercises, take caution and try on your own. It is very, very important that you try these examples on your own. That is when you can actually try to understand some of these concepts. Okay, so instead, try out example 2. It's having a lot of items, so let me just try quickly example 3. So how many things do we have? We have how many items? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So we have 5 items. We have 5 items. Let me go to the code. Okay, so I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm just going to create another HTML here, another HTML file. So insert, and I'm just going to say layout.html, layout.html, I will quickly span out this. Okay, and then let's link to the same CSS. We can also have its own CSS. Let me create another CSS, layout.css, layout.css. So that we just notice for this one. Let me also go and stop this server. So this is layout grid, and I'm just going to link to layout CSS very fast. Link CSS, and instead of style, I'm just going to say layout. Okay, as simple as that. And then how many items do I have? So I have a container, and then in this container I have 5 items. I have the first one, so I'm just going to say dot item, then dot navbar. So here this is navbar. So I'm just going to repeat all these things. So I have 5 items, copy paste 5 times, as simple as that. So the second one is, I guess, sidebar. If I look in my PowerPoint, so I have sidebar, then I have content 1, content 2, and then footer. So I have sidebar. Okay, then I have content 1, and by the way, how the things are arranged in HTML, they might not actually matter so much, since you're going to give them their locations during the grid, right? So this one is the footer. Excuse me. So as simple as that. So this is my HTML, so I want to give them another one different class. This is sidebar, and then this is content 1, and then this is content 2, and then this is footer. Okay. You can see how I'm naming them. You first give them item class. The item class is to cater for what is similar in both, and then this individual class is to cater what is different in others. Okay, so let's start. We just go to, I can first view this in the browser, go live, and there's nothing much really. You can have, we have them like so. Okay, so we start with our container. So I'm going to target the container. I go to layout.css, target the container. I'm just going to first also copy the browser reset. I'm not just going to type it again, but I can simply borrow this here, the browser reset, very fast, like so. And then in the container, the first thing we have to do is display grid. So this one defines this container to be a grid container, and that is the first step really. The first step is always set the container to display grid. That is the first thing. The second thing I consider is I go back and ask how many columns do I have. So I have 1, 2, 3. I have 3 columns. So look first at the number of columns you are going to have, and that one becomes a very good point where to start from. You first lay out the way you want your items to look like. This one becomes very easy when you have your items the way you want them to look like. It becomes very easy. So I want 3. If you look at things to look here, I have 3 columns, and then the gap I can see something like about 10 pixels or 5 pixels. So the first thing I could say, grid template columns, I say there are 3, and I can define them the Y1. Let's say 250 pixels. And by the way, instead of saying 250 pixels, so we have 250 pixels, 250 pixels, 250 pixels. I would also write this in the same way. I would say repeat, and repeat takes two things. It takes the number of things you want to repeat. So repeat 3 times 200 pixels. This one means if you write it in that way, this line of code means that let me just actually write on top here also. Let me duplicate this on top here. This one means you have 200. It means this. So this is the same. These ones are two of these ones are the same. Grid template columns, you are saying I need 3 columns, and each column is going to be 250 pixels. Or you could say repeat. So repeat takes the number of columns and the size of the column. So I want 3 columns and each to be 250. So I can first comment this and we'll look at it. You see, it has put them in that. We can first actually work on the item such that we look at how these things look like. I'm just going to say item, and let's give it some padding already of like 2 rem, and then some background color of Sunday brown, and then I think that is it. Some color, we can give it even a color of white. Okay, the color doesn't match a mat. Yeah, but you can see it has already divided it into how many columns? 1, 2, 3. So you can even put a grid gap here, a grid gap. Actually, I think you can even define just gap, and you say, let's say 10 pixels. As simple as that. Okay, so if I look right now, I have a gap of 10. Right, I have a gap of 10. So this is looking nice already. So how did we reach here? The first thing is we went to the container and find some things. The first thing is set the container to the grid by saying display grid, and then the second one, identify the number of columns you need, and we said this is same as this. Where am I right now? I'm in a wrong style sheet. Yeah, so in layout, so the first thing we have done, display grid, and the second one, define the number of rows, and we define them to be 3 and each to be 250. I said this can be, I could comment this one. I would comment this one out, and then I activate this one, and you see there is nothing different. Everything remains the same, meaning you can either write it in this way or this way. You use a repeat, or you can just simply define them out like that. So I'm just going to leave repeat for now. Then you also identify the gap. Instead of saying grid gap, simply say gap. It is okay. So for the item, we have given them some background color and some padding. That one is none. Now let's start defining each item where it belongs. Okay, so the first one, how many lines do we have? So we have this is line 1, line 2, line 3, line 4. So out of 4 lines, how many lines does navbar span? So navbar is from end to end. So I would say for navbar, say dot nav bar, I would say it on columns, grid column. How many columns do we does it span? So I would say it is from 1 to 4, as simple as that. And look at that, 1 to 4, and it is spanning, finishing everything. So that is great. You just say where it starts from and where it ends from. The another technique would be 2 minus 1. This, if you say minus 1, it is saying that from the start to the end. This minus 1 says it is from the start to the end. You can use minus 1, but for now I can just leave 4 like so. Okay, let's continue. Let's look at sidebar. Where does sidebar occupies? If you look at sidebar 1, it is in column 1. It is in column 1, but what about the rows? It occupies from line 2. So how many lines do we have for rows? So we have 1, 2, 3, also 4. All right. So we also have 4 lines. So I would say for the sidebar dot sidebar, it occupies, so for the grid column, for the grid column, let's say first put 1. By the way, here grid row is 1 also. So here grid column is 1, but for grid row it occupies from 2 to 4. If you look at it, you see it occupies from 2 to 4. As we said, this is 1, 2, 3, 4. So it occupies from line 2 to line 4. Okay, let's continue. So what about next is content 1 and content 2. So we could even first work on the footer, and we look at it. So if we work on the footer, so for the footer dot footer, where does it start from? If I look at the footer starts from 1. It is in grid row is 3. Grid row is 3, but the columns it occupies from 2. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4. So it occupies from 2 to 4. So I say grid column, it occupies from 2 to 4, but it is in grid row, it is in grid row 3. You see that? That is cool. So you just simply state where you want it to be, as simple as that. And by default, if you see, you define some and already content 1, content 2 are already in place. So guys, you can go ahead and try out this one, the same concept. Make a container and put in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 items, and grid gap, you can see it is 10 pixels. For sure, try to do what we have done and make sure you come up to this one. And we are going to use all this, the concept we have learned into this one, we are going to use it to do our next project. So thank you so much up to this point. If you have reached at this point, you are doing so great. Thank you so much, and congratulations to reach at this point in time. So I want to thank those ones. If you have not subscribed to my channel, please try to subscribe, share the content if it is working for you, so that you can, that is the way you can support me, by the way, on this channel, so that we make more videos that can actually be helpful in the future. So thank you so much. See you in the next project.